Guantanamo harms our partnerships with allies and other countries whose cooperation we need against terrorism. When I talk to other world leaders, they bring up the fact that Guantanamo's not resolved.
Welcome to Watch Mojo, and today we're counting down our picks for the wildest, most disturbing facts you should know about the notorious U.S. military prison.
President Trump has instructed officials to essentially convert into a massive detention center to hold people awaiting deportation, in this case to Venezuela.
Number 10. Hunger strikes are common.
More than half the detainees at the Guantanamo prison are now on hunger strike. Government figures disclosed this weekend show 84 of the 166 captives at the facility are now participating. A smaller number began the protest in early February. They objected to their living conditions and to alleged mishandling of the Quran by military guards.
For those unlucky enough to be detained at Guantanamo Bay, undergoing a hunger strike can be an unpleasant but effective means of protesting one's conditions and situation. Force-feeding techniques are also common in response, and according to Democracy Now!, that entailed, quote, large feeding tubes being forcefully shoved up their noses and down into their stomachs, with guards using the same tubes from one patient to another, end quote.
We were trying to be patient and work with them, give them the opportunity to comply. We hit the point where, I felt we were accepting too much risk, and it was time to take action.
A mass hunger strike held by detainees in 2013 yielded a force-feeding operation so large that the government subsequently declined to release information about incidents like this one. Some, including British Defense Attorney Clive Stafford Smith, have accused the government of fudging the numbers to reduce negative press.
These are the feeding tubes that we use whenever it is determined at a very high level that somebody has reached that point in their hunger striking. Everyone is allowed to hunger strike. That is their right to protest. But if somebody gets to that point where they need additional medical care, or it's reached the point where it's threatening their life, that's where the decision is made, way above me, to step in.
Number 9. Some released detainees returned to their former lives. For some Guantanamo Bay detainees, the American government has asserted that their imprisonment does not end their previous activities. As reported by Reuters in 2016, 111 of 532 prisoners released by the administration of George W. Bush are confirmed to have returned to the battlefield, with 74 others suspected of doing so. For example, Abdallah al-Ajmi, a Kuwaiti detainee accused of being a Taliban fighter who was released in 2006, reportedly committed a bombing in Mosul, Iraq in 2008 that took his own life and the lives of several others. However, you might want to take the government's word with a grain of salt, as their assessment of who had returned to terrorism was broadly defined. It included testimonies of former detainees who had criticized their treatment at the prison. Number 8. An Air Force veteran was permanently disabled in a training drill. Have you ever heard the name Sean Baker before? And no, we're not referring to the Honora and the Florida Project filmmaker of the same name. Baker, who is reported to have served during the First Gulf War, was part of what was supposed to be a routine training exercise at Guantanamo Bay. Baker donned an orange jumpsuit while wearing his Army uniform underneath, given the role of a fictional insubordinate detainee. However, the soldiers being trained were misinformed and believed Baker to be an actual detainee. Baker was beaten so severely that he suffered several seizures and was hospitalized for nearly 2 months as a result. Number 7. Gitmo may host a clandestine black site.
We figured that we needed to find a place where we could take Abu Zubaydah and we could debrief him secretly without the attention of the press or anybody else, and a place where Abu Zubaydah himself would know where he was.
It's inarguable that Guantanamo Bay is home to Camp 7, an area with the most intense security on the base that was initially kept secret from the public. Camp 7 was at one point populated with what the U.S. government referred to as, quote, high-value detainees, or senior members of the terrorist group al-Qaeda.
So their intentions and priorities are to protect information rather than appear innocent. And because of that, you have to find some way to shift their priorities in the moment.
However, there may or may not exist yet another, even more secretive area, Camp No. The name is sort of fitting. Camp No, whether it's real or the stuff of urban legend, is an alleged black site, which refers to a place where prisoners are held without due process. Attorney Scott Horton attested to the facility's existence in 2010 and alleged that at least 3 detainees had been killed there.
If you're talking to a person who is a senior al-Qaeda leader or something like that, it's perfectly reasonable that they would sit and say, well, Islam is the religion of peace. They use the same thing when it comes to words like innocent.
Number 6. A major 9/11 figure has been held there for almost 2 decades.
The accused mastermind of the 9/11 terror attack and 2 co-defendants have reached a plea deal. Authorities say they will now plead guilty to multiple charges, including the murder of 2,976 people, reportedly to be spared the death penalty. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the alleged mastermind, and the 2 alleged co-conspirators have been held at Guantanamo Bay for years now.
The man born Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, although he's known to have employed at least 50 pseudonyms, has quite the, let's say, distinctive resume. The former head of propaganda for al-Qaeda, Mohammed has been accused of participating in several of the most infamous terror attacks of the past few decades, like the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, Richard Reed shoe bombing attempt, murder of Daniel Pearl, and crucially, the events of 9/11.
The New York Times reporting war court prosecutors sent a letter to family members of the victims of the attacks, saying in exchange for the removal of the death penalty as a possible punishment, these 3 accused have agreed to plead guilty to all of the charged offenses, including the murder of the 2,976 people listed in the charge sheet.
In fact, the 2004 9/11 Commission report referred to Mohammed as, quote, the principal architect of the 9/11 attacks. Arrested in the Pakistani city of Rawalpindi in 2003, Mohammed has been holed up at Guantanamo Bay since 2006, bouncing around in the legal system between life in prison or the death penalty.
The Pentagon has not released details of the deal publicly, but the trials of the 9/11 conspirators has been delayed for years. Last September, President Biden rejected a set of demands that had formed the basis of the plea negotiations. Some of the victims' families had expressed outrage when word came last year that a plea deal was in the works.
Number 5. Prisoners have died there.
According to the U.S. military, he was a Taliban commander with ties to Osama bin Laden. He was never formally charged, and his lawyer long argued that Gul quit the Taliban movement before the 9/11 attacks.
Awal didn't have any property. He was a jihadi commander who fought against the Soviets. He was not a traitor. He's now a martyr.
In total, 9 detainees have died while in the custody of Guantanamo Bay. 1 died of cancer, but the other 8 cases, 1 heart attack, and 7 cases where prisoners reportedly took their own lives, have been met with scrutiny, particularly 1 incident in which 3 prisoners allegedly took their own lives in 2006. According to ex-Guantanamo guard turned whistleblower Joseph Hickman, the alleged event in which 3 prisoners took their own lives was almost certainly a cover-up. The NCIS investigation into the event was heavily criticized for inconsistencies.
They would have all 3 had to tie their hands and feet together by themselves, shoved rags down their throats, put a mask over their face, made a noose, hung it from the ceiling or the side of the cell block, jumped into the noose, and hung themselves simultaneously.
These doubts, coupled with the presence of rags in the throats of the men, aroused further suspicion of foul play. Suspicions that were fully expanded upon in a joint investigation by NBC and Harper's Magazine, which suggested that they were tortured to death during interrogation. As of 2011, it's believed that a technique called dryboarding may have been used. According to ex-Guantanamo guard turned whistleblower Joseph Hickman, the triple suicide was almost certainly a cover-up.
What did these reports claim was wrong with the story?
They claimed that I was a perimeter guard and I was never inside of Camp Delta, so I wouldn't know. The fact is more than half of my duties were spent inside of Camp Delta, and almost half was outside on the perimeter. And both positions gives me a pretty good view of what happened.
Number 4. Inmates are detained indefinitely without trial. In America, everyone has the right to a fair trial. Unfortunately for the detainees at Guantanamo Bay, that doesn't apply to them as suspected foreign terrorists, which the U.S. view as enemy combatants. In some cases, individuals have been held for more than a decade without charges or a trial. Under the Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF, of 2001, America justifies indefinite detention, deeming their detainees to be security risks. Legal loopholes aside, Human Rights Watch and the United Nations have both called this practice illegal. Of 779 detainees, most have been released without charge. According to former Bush administration official Lawrence B. Wilkerson, many detainees were handed over to the U.S. for cash bounties and were just, quote, in the wrong place at the wrong time. Number 3, minors can be detained.
I cannot answer why they were there that long, except that knowing that if they were returned, they could end up back on the battlefield and end up being killed.
There's no way that these kids know anything of any importance, and to mastermind a significant threat to anyone was probably fairly unlikely.
Ever heard of Camp Iguana? They have outdoor activities, air conditioning, televisions, twin beds, and you can see the ocean. It's basically sleepaway camp, except it's a special section of Guantanamo Bay used to house detainees under the age of 16, who they refer to as juvenile enemy combatants.
When Asadullah came out, he spoke to me in perfect English, and I was so shocked that such a young boy had been to Guantanamo Bay. But even more surprising in some ways that the experience had actually been a positive one for him. He had learned English and math, and he knew how to play chess. And he knew there were dinosaurs, that the world was round. Nobody else in his village knew any of that.
Call them whatever you want, they are children. And everywhere else in the world, taking them by force is called kidnapping, no matter how well you treat them. The parents of Asalada Rahman searched for their son for 7 months before being informed of his whereabouts. The youngest detainee ever? He was taken at just 10 years old. In total, it's been reported that 15 to 22 minors have been admitted.
زخمونه زه اوسم په ځان کې لرم او اوسم هغه درد کوي هغلته پوځیان ویلي چې پلانه یې پیژنې عکسونه به یې موږ ته راوړه داسې عکسونه به یې راوړل چې موږ به پیژندم نه موږ ډېر سختې لوږې تندې تېرې کړې اگر که ما دوی ته ډېر ورته ویلي چې ما خو نه څه جرم کړی دی د ما عمر د ما وخت او دا ساعت ما خو څه شی نه دی کړی دی موږ ته ویلي ته موږ ته پلانې او پلانې طالبان راوښیې قومندانان راوښیې.
Number 2. The rent might be cheap, but the cost is high.
The prison buildings were set up as temporary, expeditionary, war on terror sites, and they opened, as you know, in 2002, and many of the buildings and structures that they've been using are that much older and have needed repairs and replacement and maintenance.
America's Guantanamo Bay land lease reportedly only costs $4,085 per month, an arrangement dating back to the 1903 Platt Amendment. In protest of this occupation, however, Cuba has allegedly refused to cash the checks in 55 years. Despite low rent, Guantanamo Bay is staggeringly expensive.
The price of keeping a soldier, mostly National Guard, in uniform and has also gone up across the years. And this detention center of 40 prisoners has 1,800 soldiers. That's 45 troops for every prisoner.
No one seems to be able to agree on an exact figure, but the annual cost per prisoner is $900,000, according to President Obama, $2.7 million, according to Democratic Representative Adam Smith, and $5 million by the ACLU's estimation. Any of these numbers are astronomical when compared to the average cost per prisoner at a maximum security federal prison, roughly $34,000. Last tallied in 2015, Guantanamo Bay has cost the U.S. $5.6 trillion.
Guantanamo is just plain expensive. You know, it's down here in Cuba. Everything comes in by airplane or barge. Everything has a markup. Construction has a markup. This is an extremely isolated, expensive place to run this kind of operation.
Before we continue, be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You have the option to be notified for occasional videos or all of them. If you're on your phone, make sure you go into Settings and switch on your notifications. Number 1. It may never close.
For many years, it's been clear that the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay does not advance our national security. It undermines it. This is not just my opinion. This is the opinion of experts. This is the opinion of many in our military. It's counterproductive to our fight against terrorists.
When President Obama took office in 2009, he promised to close Guantanamo Bay. We've covered a wide variety of horrors perpetrated at this institution, any of which should have been enough to get that place shut down. But try as he might, Obama repeatedly failed. The reason? A government divided.
These men don't belong in a courtroom in Kentucky, Madam President. They belong at the secure detention facility at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, far, far away from U.S. civilians.
At every turn, Obama's efforts were blocked, including the passing of a bill by congressional Republicans forbidding the transfer of detainees to U.S. soil, or spending any funds to alter or build new structures to house them. With the election of Donald Trump came a promise to not only keep the prison open, but, quote, load it up with some bad dudes, including Americans, despite that being illegal. With 56% of Americans opposing its closure, it'll likely stay open or even grow.
Criminals and suspected gang members aren't the only immigrants being transported to Guantanamo Bay ahead of their planned deportation. According to both internal government documents and U.S. officials, the Trump administration is also sending nonviolent detainees who do not have serious criminal records, or in some cases, any criminal records at all.
Which Guantanamo Bay fun fact shocked you the most? Be sure to let us know in the comments below.
There were no reported serious injuries, but the prison was put on lockdown, and the number of hunger strikers skyrocketed.